Constitution. And what great timing. It's a real honor to be able to talk about our government the day after an election that we really see a lot of people participating. So it's really wonderful to be here and to share this with you all. My name is Kylie McCormick, and I'm a historian. I grew up in Casper. I went to high school at Kelly Walsh and participated in We the People. It was a lot of fun. It's a government competition. We were able to win state, and we even got to go to nationals in Washington, D.C., where I got to go into the White House and meet the vice president, age myself and say it was Dick Cheney at the time. And it was just a really wonderful experience that gave me a deep passion for this exact topic. So when Debbie reached out to me and asked if I'd be willing to put something together, I thought, yeah, that sounds like a lot of fun. So we'll see how far along we get into the Constitution here. Up at the high school we had some good conversations that lasted a little while. I wanted to start the conversation with just the most basic question of what is a Constitution? I was wondering if anybody here might have any guesses as to what you think a Constitution is. Yeah.
So it's like the government, it's like the thing that tells stuff about like how the presidents, what the presidents can do and the laws and preamble and everything.
Yeah, so you named a lot of great things that are part of our Constitution. We've got a preamble at the start of it saying the overall purpose of our document, and it talks about what the people who govern us can do. The definition that I came up with here, it says the fundamental principles by which we are governed. So basically how our government works, the rules that govern us. And there's all sorts of different forms that a constitution can take. Here in the United States, we have a philosophy that really underpins the way that we think government should work. And that is the idea of a social compact or a contract that is between the people being governed and our government. Now, this is in stark contrast to the government that we declared our independence from, Great Britain and the European monarchies. The European monarchies, they had a king and queen at the head of their government, and they believed that their power to rule over the people, it was derived from God. It was manifest. God said that they were going to be the king or queen, and that is why they were in the position that they were in, to rule over other people. In the United States, we have a much different approach, and that's based off of 300 years of European philosophers talking about this idea of a social compact, an agreement between the people being governed and their government. It says that the government is going to derive their power from the people. So rather than from God, government derives its power from the people, and people have natural rights that are endowed to them from their creator, from nature. So we have the right to, most famously, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, coming from our Declaration of Independence. This social compact, there is some give and take. So the government, they are at the will of the people, right? It's our choice to be governed. And to be in a society, we do not have absolute freedom to do whatever the heck we want. So we can't drive down the street in front of the library going 150 miles an hour. Now, even though I'm physically capable of doing that and my car will push that number, I can't do that because we live in a society and we have rules. There's really terrible things that could happen. Somebody could be crossing the street and I could hit them. We could get into a bad car accident. So for the benefit of everybody, we all agree, let's drive a reasonable speed down the road. So we don't have the absolute freedom to do whatever we want. There's limits on it. There's a really nice phrase that says that my freedom ends where your freedom begins. So some of the principles behind our government. When we're talking about different types of constitution, I will say that constitutions, there's as many different constitutions as there are countries in the world. That every country has its own unique form of government. Some really basic ideas behind constitutions are whether it's uncodified or codified. So an uncodified constitution, like what's in Great Britain, that is going to be a constitution based on the tradition, laws that are written, court cases that are passed, former precedent. It's not going to be a single document. And because of that, it's thought of as being a very flexible constitution. If Great Britain wanted to change the way that their prime minister was elected or served, they could pass some laws, maybe put it to a vote if they wanted the people to vote on it, and they could change the way that their government works. In the United States, we have a codified constitution. That means that we have a document. We have an actual piece of paper that says, hey, this is how the presidency works, this is how our legislature works, this is how the judicial branch works. We have amendments to that document that recognize our individual liberties, the Bill of Rights, and we have a document that our rule of law is based on. It's not just based on the laws that Congress passes or a tradition that we have as a society. A codified constitution is thought of being as very inflexible, and it's inflexible because it's difficult to change. It takes 2/3 majority, both houses in Congress, in order to push in an amendment, and that amendment doesn't immediately go into law once it passes through Congress. It has to then go over to the states. And once it's at the states, we're talking about 3/4 of the states have to approve it before we have an amendment to our Constitution. And today we have 50 states, so that's 38 states that would have to ratify an amendment before we can change something. The last amendment to be ratified happened in the 1990s, and it was actually one of the original amendments that James Madison proposed when he first wrote the Bill of Rights. That's the 27th Amendment. It basically says, hey, those people in Congress, they can't increase their paycheck. If they vote to increase their paycheck, it's not going to go into law until after the next election. So good idea, James Madison. A little bit of background about how did we get the government that we have here in the United States. And it started out a little accidental with our Continental Congress. The Continental Congress did not meet to declare their independence from Great Britain. In fact, they were responding to a series of events. Great Britain, they had waged a war against France known as the 7 Years' War. And in the United States, or what would become the United States in North America, the front of that war, the theater, was called the French and Indian War. France had allied with several Native American nations. Great Britain had allied with several Native American nations, and they fought each other. Great Britain did end up winning this war. They won several of the Western territories that used to belong to France. Got someone who's French in the audience who's not too sure about that.
I don't like that. I want to complain.
And so Great Britain, they had successfully fought this war. Part of the war had taken place in the colonies, and they got into a lot of debt from it. And they thought, well, you know, who should pay this debt but the people who are benefiting from the outcome of the war? The colonists should be responsible for paying this debt. And in order to get that money back in their treasury, they taxed the colonists on luxury goods and imported goods such as tea. How do you think the colonists, do you think that they liked that? No, not at all. There was an issue in the colonies. They didn't have a representative for them in the parliament. And so these taxes are coming and they say, hey, no taxation without representation. And there's an event that happens in Boston known as the Boston Tea Party, where a group of men known as the Sons of Liberty, they decide that they're going to protest these taxes, and they board the merchant ships that are bringing in the British tea, and they throw them over the ships into the harbor. Now, Great Britain, they did not respond with, hey, you know, we really hear you, what an excellent idea, we'll add a representative to our parliament. That is not how Great Britain responded. Instead, they said, we're going to crack down on these colonists. They passed coercive laws where they were bringing in more of a militia to be in the colonies and say, you need to pay these taxes, and they brought on more taxes to the colonists. So the colonists were starting to get very frustrated, and the way that they responded, they said, hey, let's send delegates from each of the 13 colonies to get together and form a continental congress, and we are going to boycott British imported goods. Everything that's being taxed, we're going to create a boycott against this. This boycott had varied success, I would say, not quite, didn't give them the outcome that they wanted. First, the Continental Congress, when they got together, they passed an Articles of Association, so they're very independent at this point. Each colony has its own form of government, and they say, we're just going to work together to pass this boycott. They sent a petition to King George. They thought that the British Parliament was the main aggressor, and so they did not send it to British Parliament. They sent it to the king and said, hey, get these guys in line, and we need a representative, and tried to reason with the king. They also sent a notice explaining the purpose of the boycott and what was going on to all of the people in the colonies, and all of the people in Great Britain, the citizens of Great Britain, they directly addressed. And part of this is because they viewed themselves as citizens of Great Britain. They're British citizens. They were loyal to their country. They said, hey, fellow citizen, look at what's happening against us here in the colonies. We deserve representation, and you should stand with us against this tyranny. And they sent one more notice to a colony up north into Quebec. Canada ended up being very loyal to Great Britain throughout the American Revolution, but we tried to get them to be on our side early on. The Continental Congress, they had met in 1774, and they said, let's meet 1 year from now in 1775, and in the time that it took for them to meet again, war broke out. The battles of Lexington and Concord happened April 19th, 1775, before they could meet. The Second Continental Congress, meeting in 1775, they said, let's try to end this war peaceably. Let's try to remain loyal to Great Britain. They extended the Olive Branch Petition, trying to end that war, and King George, he refused to even look at it. And at this point, the colonies start seeing themselves becoming more and more responsible for the governing of the Continental Congress, the governing of all of these colonies. And that's because British rule was starting to crumble under the outrages, the war that had broken out in the colonies. So they become the de facto government of the colonies, is this Continental Congress. At this point, they don't have a constitution. All they have is an Articles of Association that they're going to work together to maybe do something. They do decide in June 1776 to pass a resolution known as the Lee Resolution. A gentleman from Virginia, Richard Henry Lee, decided that he's going to declare the independence of these colonies, and that's what the Continental Congress should do. So by 1776, they take this step to pass the Lee Resolution and say, we are not colonies of Great Britain anymore, we are going to be individual states. When I say the word states, we have a lot of connotation that comes with that, where we think, as the United States of America, we don't really think about Colorado as being a foreign country, right? It's just our neighbor down south. When the members of Continental Congress are talking about states and passing this resolution, they're really thinking about these colonies as separate countries, and that's what they mean by the word state. I think of it a lot like the Continental Congress is serving as a European Union, and these states are different European countries. Just because a country is part of the European Union does not mean that they are the same as another country that's part of the European Union. They are their own sets of governments. And so that's really the philosophy that these states are taking when they're working with each other. They are not necessarily saying, let's all be one huge country together. even though that's where we ended up, which is really interesting to think about. After they pass that resolution, they do something very famous, one of our most famous documents. It's the Declaration of Independence. They have a committee set aside. Thomas Jefferson leads that committee, and he drafts our Declaration of Independence. And now, even though we have a codified constitution where we have a single document that says how our government works, we do have a lot of traditional governments and traditional philosophies that underpin our understanding of what it means to be an American, what it means to live in this country. And I think that the Declaration of Independence is definitely one of those founding documents. I want to read just the second paragraph from that document. It is the most recognizable part of it. It says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed." So that's a very eloquent way to talk about that social compact, that idea that I spoke about at the very beginning of the presentation. This is a government that is drawing its power from the consent of the governed, and the rights that people have, they're not coming from the government, they don't come from a king and queen, they come from nature, they come from a creator, God. By 1777, the Continental Congress realized, they said, we need a form of government. They were a little bit over their heads. They didn't have a way of how they are going to function as a Congress. And so that's when they draft the Articles of Confederation. There's a really great quote in Federalist, I want to say it's Federalist number 10, written by James Madison, where he talks about the Greek city-states and how they swung on a pendulum of extremes. I think that is really what we see happen during the American Revolution. There was a strong centralized government in Great Britain. There was a monarch and a parliament who held the power, and the states, they swing that pendulum to the other extreme, and they create a government that is decentralized and does not have a lot of power. The Articles of Confederation, it was basically a league of friendship between the states, and they didn't have the power to do things like, they did not have an executive branch, they did not have a judicial branch, so if there was a disagreement between two states, they did not have the power to help settle that disagreement. They also had a very weak ability to even pass a law. It required a supermajority of the states. 9 out of the 13 states had to agree in order to pass a law. If they wanted to amend the Articles of Confederation, they had to have a unanimous consent from all 13 states. They didn't have the ability to implement any taxes, and they could request money from the states, and the states could decide whether or not they wanted to give that money or whether or not they were able to give the money. And so a majority of the states were not giving money to the Confederation Congress. Rather, they were keeping it for themselves, what little they had. And so the Confederation Congress, they had allied with countries like France. That's one of the reasons why we won the American Revolution, was thanks to the help from our friends in France. And they also borrowed a great deal of money from France and from other European countries. We were able to purchase weapons to fight the war, and we got into a lot of debt, in part because we could not raise money, we could not implement a tax with the Articles of Confederation. So there's federal government going into a lot of debt. The Articles of Confederation, they were not ratified. They did not go into power until 1781, 4 years after they were drafted, because every single state had to sign on before they became the government. So It was adopted in 1777, went into effect when Maryland signed it into law in 1781. By 1781, the American Revolution is coming to a close. We have our last major battle that happens in Yorktown in 1781, and that is a very decisive victory for the United States, or for the Confederation of States. And at that point, Great Britain decides to cease hostilities. It isn't until representatives of the Confederation and representatives of Great Britain meet together in Paris in 1783 that we see the formal end of that war. And by then, the Confederation was well underway with a very weak government, huge debts and no way to pay them. And this is happening at a state-by-state level as well. This is a woodblock carving image that would appear in a newspaper of a Revolutionary War hero, a veteran named Daniel Shays. Daniel Shays, he was a farmer in Massachusetts. Massachusetts was undergoing economic depression. They were in debt just like the federal government was in debt. And so the way that they decided to handle this debt was to tax people like these farmers. Now, farmers like Daniel Shays, who had fought in the Revolutionary War, they were waiting on back pay from the federal government for fighting in the war. The government did not have money to pay the soldiers who fought. And so he is borrowing money from creditors, and then pretty soon those creditors say, all right, it's time to pay back with interest. So the farmers are finding themselves in a very difficult position in Massachusetts. They were in a huge amount of debt, no way to pay it back, and they were being thrown into debtors' prisons. They were also having their farms seized by their creditors. And so Daniel Shays and a group of soldiers, they decide to petition the Massachusetts government. And they ask for three things. They say, stop taxing us for 1 year. We need a break. We need to have a chance to catch our breath. No taxes for 1 year. Second demand was that they close the courts. If the courts were closed, then their property could not be confiscated. It couldn't be seized. And the third request was for the state of Massachusetts to print more money and have more paper currency. That would create a situation of inflation, and they thought that they could sell their goods at a higher rate and earn more capital in order to pay their debts. Massachusetts, they said, no, we need these taxes because we're in debt. And they sided with the creditors and said, you entered into a contract and you need to uphold that contract. Now, this did not sit well with the veterans of the Revolutionary War. They said, we just fought a war over taxes. I think it's quite ironic, the situation that the United States finds itself in after the Revolutionary War. We fought the Revolutionary War because Great Britain had huge war debts and they were trying to pay them off by taxing the people. It was a very expensive war. We went into debt fighting it, and we decide, how are we going to pay these war debts? By taxing the people. And so the people who fought in this, they said, hey now, this isn't fair to us. We just got through this. And they decide to create a rebellion. They go county by county through Massachusetts and shut down the courts. It started out with a couple dozen men, and it grows to about 1,500 men before Massachusetts says, we need our militia to respond. And they call out the militia to respond to these rebels. Now the militiamen, they say, whoa, 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 I'm not going to do this. That's my brother, that's my neighbor, that's my father. I'm not going to raise arms against them, and they flat out refuse. They also, and that's at best, at worst, the men in the Massachusetts militia, they say, you know, these rebels have a point, and they join with them. So quite a predicament that they found themselves in. Massachusetts, they reached out to the Confederation Congress. They said, please help us quell this rebellion. They are going to overthrow our state government. We need help from the Confederation. And the Confederation, they initially agreed, but then they did not have the money to raise a militia. They were also in a lot of debt. They reached out to the states looking for volunteers. They didn't get a lot of volunteers. And so there's the Confederation finding themselves inept at responding to an internal rebellion. And that's going to make a lot of people really worried. By September 1886, there is a group of people that they're going to get together and say, we need to get rid of this Confederation, or we need to amend it and fix it somehow. There were 5 states that were represented at that agreement. That happened in September 1786, and they agreed to meet because there were only 5 of them. They had no power to pass any laws. They needed 9 states to pass a law. They had no power to amend the Confederation. They needed to have 13 states to do an amendment, so they put word out to all 13 states and said, send delegates May 1787. And one state thought, I like this Confederation and I don't want it to be changed. They can't change it if I don't show up. That was Rhode Island. So Rhode Island doesn't show up, and there are 55 delegates gathered in Philadelphia in May 1787, and they say, you know what? Shut the door, close the blinds, we're going to start over. Call this a bloodless revolution, because they really, from May to September in 1787, they created a new form of government and overthrew the Confederation. They created our Constitution, and we became the United States of America after what these men did in this room and after that document was ratified by the states. Of those 55 delegates that were in the room, 39 ended up signing the finished document. There were a lot of disagreements that happened in Philadelphia over the course of those months, and a lot of compromises. I think that that's really important to think about, all of the compromises that have happened in our government, starting at its very inception. Some of those compromises, they focused a lot on representation. Large states like Virginia, they wanted to institute a plan where Congress would be based on population. So they would have, you would have more representatives if you had a larger population in 2 houses of Congress. New Jersey was a small state, had a very small population at the time, and they said, no thank you, and instituted their own plan where they said each state should have 1 representative in 1 body of Congress. It was the representatives from Connecticut who came up with a compromise. And they said, let's do both plans. Let's have 2 bodies of Congress. 1, a Senate, where we're going to have, anybody know how many senators per state? Yeah, 2. That's right. So 2 senators per state. And we're going to have a House of Representatives. That House of Representatives is going to be based on population. And yeah, how many do we have in Wyoming? Only 1. That's right. So we've got 3 members of Congress in Wyoming. And that compromise, that's something that even grows into a larger compromise. At the time, there was slavery throughout the United States. New York, we think about by the time the Civil War happens, we have the North versus the South. At the time of the Revolutionary War and the drafting of our Constitution, there was still slavery in the North, in New York and New Jersey. But they didn't have large plantations like they had in the South. And they didn't have a large population of people who are enslaved. The southern states that have this large population of people who are enslaved, they say, hey, these people should count towards our representation in the House of Representatives. And the people in the North said, that's not fair. No, they shouldn't count at all. And they end up coming up with a compromise that I think is a real, when it comes to slavery, I think that this is really the real blight on our Constitution. They come up with a clause called the 3/5 compromise, the 3/5 clause. And essentially, an enslaved person, they aren't going to count as a whole person, they're going to count as 3/5 of a person. And I think that the framers, there is an argument to be had that even the ones who are slaveholders, like James Madison, they know that slavery is not going to look good from our perspective today. That when we look back at this period, that we were going to judge them for the wrongs that were committed. And for, especially after fighting a Revolutionary War where they talked about liberty and freedom, this was not lost on this generation. And because of that, you see them using these bureaucratic euphemisms to talk about slavery. They're going to talk around it. When they talk about the 3/5 clause, they say 3/5 of all other persons. The word slave, slavery, enslaved, it doesn't appear anywhere in our Constitution. So we had some compromises, some better than others. Now I talked about that pendulum swinging and how they were responding to a strong centralized government, created a decentralized government. Now the pendulum is going to be responding to both sides. It says we don't want that monarchy. We also don't want an inept government that can't do anything. How are we going to create a government that has a strong central power, but isn't going to become a tyranny like what Great Britain became to us, and not encroach upon our liberties? And the way that they're going to do this is through a separation of powers. They create 3 branches of government rather than investing all of the power into one branch of government, like a parliament or something like that. They create 3 separate branches: a legislative branch, an executive branch, and a judicial branch. And they separate these powers out. So for instance, the executive branch, we have our president, who is the commander-in-chief, which means that he is in charge of our military. Now, even though he's in charge of our military, or she, if we decide one day, that president, they cannot go into and just start a war. The ability to declare war is vested in the legislative branch. They also cannot say, we're tired of this war, let's sign this treaty and the war is over. That's also vested in the legislative branch. So we have this separation of power when it comes to our military. And this comes in a lot of different ways. The legislative branch, they have the ability to pass laws, but they do not go into act until the executive branch is signed by the president. And that's a system of checks and balances that is developed from the separation of these powers. So the legislative branch has the ability to write laws. The executive branch has the ability to veto those laws. Executive branch, they have the ability to nominate justices for the Supreme Court. The legislative branch, they have the ability to say no to those nominations, or say, yeah, that's a great choice. Let's put them into power. What's interesting to me is that what we think of as the largest, the best check that the judicial branch has on the other 2 is something that isn't in our Constitution. What do you think the primary role of the Supreme Court is? If a law is passed and you say this law is encroaching on my rights that are guaranteed to me by the Constitution, I'm going to take this through the court system all the way to the Supreme Court, and then the Supreme Court is going to get to decide whether that law is constitutional or unconstitutional. And we think of this as really foundational to the Supreme Court, but it isn't something that came about from our Constitution. It actually came about in 1803 when we have a transfer of power happening between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. And these 2 were in 2 totally different political parties. They were not fans of each other. John Adams, on his way out the door, he wanted to make a series of appointments. He took those appointments and he put them on the desk of the incoming Secretary of State, James Madison. James Madison saw those appointments, took one look at them, and they disappeared, never to be seen again. This would be like right now we have President-elect Trump and President Joe Biden. is still in power, it would be like Joe Biden the day before President-elect Trump comes in saying, let me make these appointments, and President Trump is going to have to fulfill this. So you can really see how they're not fans of each other, and they probably aren't going to do that. What happens is one of the men who was supposed to receive an appointment for Justice of the Peace, William Marbury, he says, I was supposed to receive my appointment, and he sues James Madison. The case goes directly to the Supreme Court, and they find themselves in a really sticky situation. If they side with Marbury, they're giving a lot of power to the Federalist political party. If they side with Madison, they're giving a lot of power to the Democratic Republicans, that was the party of Thomas Jefferson. And it's really a no-win situation, no matter which way they side on this. And so instead, they decide to take power for themselves. And they say, you didn't go through the proper channels, the district courts, before you brought this to us. And therefore, the process was unconstitutional. And they created this power of deeming whether something was constitutional or unconstitutional. It's interesting, something so foundational that we really think of as the primary function of our Supreme Court didn't come about until 1803, and it's something that they took for themselves. Now, what a perfect time to talk about this, the voting and the Electoral College. I want to give some context for this and how our founders were thinking about voting. In the 1780s, when they were drafting the Constitution, there was no universal male suffrage. It was really the right to vote, which is what suffrage means, the right to vote, that this was based on property. If you owned land, or if you were a taxpayer, then you had the right to vote. If you were, let's say you were just a merchant in one of these states that had a rule about land, then you didn't have the right to vote. It was something that was only vested in the landowners. It isn't until 1856 that we get a universal male suffrage. And universal male suffrage means that the only restriction on it is how old you are. There is no restriction on whether or not you have property or anything like that. It isn't until 1870, when we ratify the 15th Amendment, that black men have the right to vote by saying that we are not going to discriminate on the basis of race. And it isn't until 1920, with the passage of the 19th Amendment, that women have universal suffrage in the United States. I will say that we're really lucky here in Wyoming. We live in the suffrage state. Right when we became a territory in 1869, our first territorial legislature, they got together and they passed a law recognizing women's right to vote. When we became a state in 1890, we became the first state recognizing women's right to vote. We are the first place in the world with a universal women's suffrage. There were other places in the past that had suffrage for women based on property rights. We're the first one to say that you don't have to own property, you are a citizen. And it's really incredible, and I think something to be proud of here in Wyoming. But when we think about our founders and voting, they are not coming from a position that we are in today where we have universal suffrage as something that we almost take for granted. They are coming from a position where the right to vote is vested in a landed gentry, an aristocracy almost. And they were really nervous about, they were people who studied the past deeply, especially those Greek city-states, and they saw a lot of danger in a direct democracy. They said that a direct democracy could become mob rule, and it would become a tyranny. That they see all of these governments, different forms of governments, developing into a tyranny, and so they want to fight against that in some way. The way that they set up the government to be able to have a buffer from that, a great way to think about it, is our Senate. Yesterday, I was able to go into the poll and vote for whoever I wanted to be Wyoming senator. That was not the case until 1913. 1913, the 17th Amendment was ratified, And that made the election of our senators a direct election, a popular vote in each state. Before 1913, you would vote for your state legislature, and then your state legislature would choose who your senator was going to be. And that's the way that functioned. It was a buffer between the population of a popular vote and the Senate. The Electoral College is a similar buffer. Our president is not elected based on population. Our president is elected by a group known as the Electoral College. And do you think, or you notice anything in particular about the numbers here? So we've got 3 Electoral College votes in Wyoming. What does that number match?
Representative in the Senate.
Exactly, yeah. So it is reflective of how many people you have in Congress. That's how many Electoral College votes you have. They could have had Congress or congressmen and women vote for the president, and they decided not to. They thought that was way too much power for the legislative branch, and so they created a entirely new body of people who are going to be responsible to the states and cast their votes. The majority of the states, as we can see, I took this, it's probably changed since I took this screenshot. It was right at the very last minute before I got on the road to come to Lusk. And this is the way that the map looked from our election yesterday. And you can see the majority of the states, they are on the basis of the popular vote. So Wyoming, we voted for Trump, and he gets all 3 of our Electoral College votes. Colorado, the popular vote went to Kamala Harris. She receives all 10 of their Electoral College votes. But you see something different happening in Nebraska and in Maine. And the way that they set this up is that they have different districts in their states. And part of this is to protect the rural areas of their states from the large cities. Nebraska has 2 very large cities, Lincoln and Omaha. And if they went by the popular vote in Nebraska, Lincoln and Omaha would dictate the way the entire state votes. Instead, they have it broken up by districts across the state, and you can see that the majority of those districts, they went towards Trump, and then one of those districts went towards Kamala Harris. And you see the opposite happen in Maine, where one of their districts went towards Trump, and 3 of their districts went towards Kamala Harris. So right now with the Electoral College, each state has the ability to decide how this is going to function for them. The majority of us, they say by popular vote, and there is a movement in the United States saying we should abolish the Electoral College and be purely popular vote. And one of the things that you'll see come up time and time again when people make that argument is, why is Wyoming so overrepresented that we have more people for our representatives than California has for their representatives? And I say, oh, come on, we only have 3 votes, they have 54. You're dropping the bucket. I think whether we have popular vote or Electoral College on that one. But it's an interesting system and an interesting debate to be had. I know a woman in Wyoming who was really very incredible for our state, Grace Raymond Hebert. She worked at the university and did a lot of things like create our state flag and build up the library down at the university. She was alive when the 17th Amendment was ratified in 1913, and she said our government is trending towards democracy, and she believed that one day we would have a direct vote for our president, that we would have a popular vote for our president. Now when this Constitution goes to the people, there is a group of them who say, we don't like this Constitution. We do not want to ratify it. They are known as the Anti-Federalists. One of the most prominent Anti-Federalists that I think we should all know about is a man named George Mason. George Mason lived in Virginia, and he wrote some very significant documents. He wrote the Virginian Declaration of Rights, the Virginian Bill of Rights, and he was one of the authors of the Virginian Constitution. These are really incredible documents. You would think that our Bill of Rights is plagiarized from the Virginian Bill of Rights and the Declaration of Rights, that it's almost word for word what George Mason wrote. Our Constitution, in large part, is based on the Virginian Constitution, that was one of the finest constitutions that was presented, and our form of government mirrors the Virginian Constitution quite a bit. So George Mason, he was somebody who really believed in individual liberties, and his primary complaint about the Constitution, and what you see him, this is the #1 complaint that he has in a list of about 20 or so complaints, and his objection to this constitution of government. He says, "There is no Declaration of Rights, and the laws of the general government being paramount to the laws and constitution of the several states, the Declaration of Rights in separate states are no security." So for instance, in Massachusetts, they had passed a militia act, a riot act, in response to Shays' Rebellion. That riot act, it said that you could not gather together in groups of 12 or more people and assemble in protest, and if you did assemble in a protest of 12 or more people, the police had the right to arrest you, beat you, and even kill you if necessary. And so that's a very intense very intense act that Massachusetts passed. Today in the United States, one of our founding principles that's in the Bill of Rights, we have the right to peaceably assemble. So we have the right to protest. It's protected by our federal government. A single state can't say, you don't have the right to protest, and take that right away from you if you are peaceably gathering together, and keyword on peaceably, gathering together to protest something. That's protected by our Bill of Rights. But the Bill of Rights, it wasn't part of the Constitution when it went out to be ratified. We just have the things that we love about our Constitution that we think of being so foundational. They weren't initially part of the Constitution. And that's in large part because James Madison did not think it was necessary at the time. And in the process of ratification, James Madison, listening to the Anti-Federalists, he said, you know, this is actually making a lot of sense. I really do think that we should amend the Constitution and add in these individual liberties. James Madison, he was one of the authors of the Federalist Papers. The Federalist Papers are over 80 different pamphlets that were printed in New York newspapers defending the Constitution and describing the ideas behind it. And so he's one of the many authors of these. This is one of the quotes from Federalist 49 that really talks about the social compact. The people are the only legitimate fountain of power, and it is from them that the constitutional charter under which the several branches of government hold their power is derived. So again, that's another way of saying that the power to be governed comes from the people. James Madison, they are successful in ratifying the Constitution. They have 9 of the 13 states sign on in 1788, and then the first Congress, they sit in March 4th, 1789, and the first thing that they consider is a Bill of Rights because of this conversation that was happening between the Anti-Federalists and the Federalists. So it's that civil dialogue, that ability to disagree with each other and to really listen to those people that we disagree with and have a civil conversation that gives us one of the finest parts of our Constitution, that Bill of Rights. James Madison, he's known as the father of the Constitution. He's also the person who authored these Bill of Rights. He had authored 12 amendments. They are able to ratify 10 of those amendments, and that becomes what's known as the Bill of Rights. And it's fun for me that the last one that was ratified was one of James Madison's in 1992. That's the 27th Amendment that I talked about at the very beginning of the presentation. The other one that was not ratified would probably not be smart to ratify today. It was about our representation, and if it was in law, we would have thousands of people in our House of Representatives. It would be a little unbearable. So I don't think he imagined the population growth that we've had in the United States when he wrote that one. But this first 10 in the Bill of Rights, this has become really foundational to our country and to the way that we think about our liberties here in the United States. And so with that, I just want to thank everybody for coming out tonight and open it up if anybody has any questions or or any comments, anybody wants to talk about the Constitution and government. I think that we have a little bit of time here for questions.
I just appreciated the explanation of the Electoral College, because that's always been a little bit of like, why does that all work? How does? So that clarified a lot for me. And even those districts, the kids and I were watching the map yesterday and today, and I wasn't sure what that meant. So that was very helpful.
Well, good. Thank you. Yeah, I always found it a little confusing too at first.
So with the Electoral College, there's nothing that requires them to vote according to the representations, correct?
Right, so each state is going to decide for themselves as to how they want this to work, but when they get in there and they cast their ballots, they are independent people, and they can cast them how they see fit. And that is really what the founders thought was going to be the wisest choice, was to have somebody who was well-read and understood what was going on and had their pulse on the politics to ultimately make that decision.
Has there ever been a case where the Electoral College doesn't follow what should have been?
Yes, there has been, and I'm forgetting the exact election where it happened, but there has been a few different cases. There have been cases where the Electoral College, a candidate won the Electoral College and they did not win the popular vote. But there's also been a case where it was too close to call and sort of some backroom deals happened. And at that point, if the Electoral College fails, it goes to the House of Representatives to make the decision. And I'm trying to remember which president we ended up with. I think it was, I won't say because I'm probably going to be wrong on that one. But yes, that has happened at least once, where our Electoral College didn't quite vote for the person that they were supposed to be voting for, according to their states.
And why is there there's no consequence for that?
No, each state gets to decide their electors, and so the consequence might just be that you don't get to be an elector next time.
The electoral, when the people from the electoral, is it secret who they vote for? Do you know? Or
no, it is not.
Okay.
So
you would know.
Yes, just how we expect it to look exactly like this map.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
What's the population per electoral vote?
Oh, I should know this it's going to be based on our House of Representatives population.
Okay.
So we're the least populated state in the union. We have one representative and in our House, and then we have our 2 senators. So states like California, I think, is the largest populated state. They have 2 senators and 52 members in the House of Representatives, and so that's why they have so many electoral votes. So it's really dependent on how many people we have in the House.
You don't know what that.
I should. I'm forgetting the exact proportion there.
No.
Yeah.
It is 270, the split in half of how many.
That's right. So, and that would change. It's a simple majority, so they don't have to have a super majority. It's just a simple, as soon as you get the majority of the votes, then you become the president. And that if we went through a huge population boom in Wyoming and we started to look more even like Arizona with 11 votes, or oh my goodness, Texas with 40, then that simple majority that majority number would change. It wouldn't be 270. There would be a larger number that they would have to get to.
Okay.
Well, I just want to thank everybody for coming out tonight and participating in civics twice. I hope that you all who are old enough went out and voted yesterday. And thanks for coming today to talk about our Constitution with me.
Thank you.
Thank you.